So just a yes or no, you still do not have a plan?
I have concepts of a plan. I'm not president right now.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down our picks for the American presidents who, for better or worse, left their mark on history and gotten people talking in the process. For this list, we're considering the president's actions, use of executive authority, and personal conduct.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Number 10, Bill Clinton.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never.
Yeah, we're starting off strong with this one. You probably already know the circumstances that led to Clinton becoming the first American president to be impeached since Andrew Johnson over 100 years earlier.
These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
But for the uninitiated, a quick recap. Clinton, who enjoyed relatively high approval ratings going into his second term, was rocked by the revelation that he'd carried out an affair with 22-year-old White House intern Monica Lewinsky from 1995 to 1997. A poll carried out at the end of Clinton's presidency revealed that 68% of the Americans surveyed believed that he would be best remembered for the Lewinsky scandal.
Indeed, I did have a relationship with Miss Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong. It constituted a critical lapse in judgment and a personal failure on my part for which I am solely and completely responsible. I misled people, including even my wife.
Number 9, James Buchanan.
I know that it is generally in bad taste for anyone to speak of his own motives. I always tried to be wise as the serpent, but harmless as the dove.
Don't blame yourself if you don't remember President Buchanan from history class. In fact, if he were around today, he'd probably prefer that. Buchanan's political decisions leading up to the Civil War and prior to the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln have led him to be considered as one of the worst U.S. presidents to ever hold the nation's highest office.
I think he was a man carried out of his depth, out of the depth of normal politics, by the intensity of emotion that was beginning to be felt both North and South. And those emotions and the activists who held them created a polarization that pulled the rest of the country along and apart.
Instead of taking decisive action on secession and the brewing tensions between the North and South, Buchanan merely waffled. Even though he disagreed with secession, the 15th president argued that the federal government's hands were tied. Ultimately, Buchanan alienated his own party through this indecision, unfortunately solidifying his legacy.
His tragedy, and I think it was a tragedy, is that he found himself at the end of his term presiding over the beginnings of the dissolution of the Union, powerless to stop it. But had he been a stronger man or a luckier man, I don't think it would have made a substantial difference.
Number 8, Ronald Reagan.
A charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon, that the United States undercut its allies and secretly violated American policy against trafficking with terrorists. Those charges are utterly false.
President Reagan's tenure in the White House was marred by scandal and stark polarization over his policymaking, as well as his administration's conduct, which reflected negatively on him. Chief among these was his handling of the Iran-Contra affair, which revealed that the United States had illegally sold weapons to arms-embargoed Iran.
Other reports have surfaced alleging U.S. involvement. Reports of a sea lift to Iran using Danish ships to carry American arms, of vessels in Spanish ports being employed in secret U.S. arms shipments, of Italian ports being used, of the U.S. spending or sending spare parts and weapons for combat aircraft.
Although Reagan claimed to be unaware of the scandal's true depth, critics accused him of either lying or being so incompetent that he was out of the loop with regard to his own administration's activities. This was in addition to Reaganomics, economic policies which disproportionately benefited the wealthy, and his draconian war on drugs, which saw non-violent offenders locked up.
The perception is growing that the crime problem stems from the emergence of a new privileged class in America. A class of repeat offenders and career criminals who think they have a right to victimize their fellow citizens with virtual impunity. They're openly contemptuous of our way of justice.
Number 7, Thomas Jefferson.
In America, in his time, 20% of all the population was enslaved. And Jefferson was one of those slaveholders. So coming to Monticello is an opportunity for people to think about this complexity.
The United States' third president has consistently been ranked by scholars and historians as one of the nation's greatest. However, that generous assessment sits at odds with Jefferson's well-documented support of slavery. Jefferson is reported to have owned, at one point or another, over 600 slaves, freeing only 2 of them during his lifetime.
I think he was a great founding father, but I also know that he enslaved many of my ancestors. So it's just learning about a time of history and acknowledging it for what it was and not trying to paint it one way or the other.
While Jefferson did indeed harbor racist beliefs that were commonplace at the time, his pro-slavery views were privately motivated by his considerable personal debt. The remainder of his slaves were sold off after his death to cover what he owed. Historian James Lowen summed it up by noting that Jefferson, quote, wrestled with slavery even though in the end he lost.
In order to see Jefferson clearly, you have to see him through the lens and through the eyes of his enslaved population. And even if only what we know about them is their name, it is significant.
Number 6, Warren G. Harding.
I believe in party government as distinguished from personal government. Individual, dictatorial, autocratic, or whatnot. It was the intent of the Founding Fathers to give this republic a dependable and enduring popular government.
Unlike several other presidents on our list today, Harding was hardly controversial during his lifetime. Quite the contrary, Harding was actually quite popular with the American public, owing to his campaign pledge to return daily life to the, quote, normalcy of pre-World War I times. As such, his sudden death in August of 1923 shocked the nation, and he was widely mourned. That is, until a number of posthumous scandals were unearthed, tarnishing his legacy.
Harding's reputation was simply attacked in a way that, so I would argue, no other president of the United States has suffered those attacks. I think they were in part because of the coming election of 1924.
These included the Teapot Dome scandal, in which Interior Secretary Albert Bacon Fall was convicted of accepting bribes from oil companies for drilling rights. This was in addition to his numerous extramarital affairs, which resulted in the president fathering a child.
Well, it's an interesting dichotomy. We like Mr. Harding because he did a great job with starting a newspaper in our community. He provided a lot of jobs. He also was a great civic leader and really encouraged new business here in Marion during its industrial development. But we also are very well aware of many of the things that others have written and said about Mr. Harding, some true, some not true.
Number 5, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
I emphasize to you that the deep question in this campaign is one of confidence in leadership.
FDR's particular brand of controversy has surprisingly little to do with the fact that he remains the longest-serving president in history, serving 4 terms over 12 years until his death. Taking office in 1933, FDR was faced with tackling the Great Depression, which his predecessor, Herbert Hoover, had failed to contain.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured.
In response, Roosevelt implemented the iterative New Deal, which aimed to provide economic relief and stimulate job creation, among other goals. New Deal programs helped the country get back on its feet, but critics asserted that those same programs constituted a form of government overreach and accused Roosevelt of attempting to sow communism on U.S. soil.
When Roosevelt did take the oath of office, the banks in most states were closed, and in others there was a limitation on how much you could withdraw. And this is as close to paralysis in a capitalist system as we can get.
Number 4, Abraham Lincoln.
I guarantee you those who knew Lincoln best never called him Honest Abe or Old Abe. So Lincoln was a very shrewd manufacturer of his public image.
At first glance, you might be inclined to do a double take when you hear that Lincoln was, in his lifetime, a highly polarizing figure who was detested by many. In fact, prior to his April 1865 assassination at the hands of John Wilkes Booth, some of his political enemies were already plotting his demise. Lincoln earned his controversial status by openly advocating for the end of slavery, despite initially promising the southern states that he wouldn't involve himself in their affairs.
He persuaded people that there was a secondary cause to the war, that union meant liberty, that liberty would preserve the union. It was intertwined.
Every man has a right to be equal with every other man. In this great struggle, this form of government and every form of human right is endangered if our enemies succeed.
The Emancipation Proclamation was Lincoln's crowning achievement. On January 1st, 1863, the executive order was signed into law, freeing over 3 million enslaved African Americans. Among other Confederate grievances, this led Booth to take the president's life.
I don't think Southerners ever really anticipated a loss. And so when the South did lose, there were people who were inconsolable. And of course, Lincoln was at the center of that.
He believed that he had one last chance to save the South, and that was to assassinate Abraham Lincoln.
Number 3, George W. Bush.
Bush versus Gore was a watershed moment where the curtain was lifted on our election system in the United States, and we realized we've got to do something to fix it. And in some ways, Congress did, but then there were the unintended or possibly intended consequences.
Even the start of Bush the Younger's presidency was riddled with controversy. After a contentious election that saw the courts deciding the election in Bush's favor, the 9/11 terrorist attacks on New York City changed everything. The Iraq War began as a direct response to the attacks, based on intel that suggested Iraqi President Saddam Hussein harbored weapons of mass destruction.
Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, yet our purpose is sure. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder.
No such weapons were ever found, and Bush's administration was harshly criticized for the ensuing Iraqi and American casualties. As if that wasn't enough, Bush came under fire for approving, quote, enhanced interrogation techniques, that is, torture, to be used on people suspected of terrorism, as well as his mishandling of the fallout of Hurricane Katrina.
The memory of traveling down to New Orleans is one of the most searing memories I have as secretary. I was surprised to find so many families still struggling to get back in their homes.
Number 2, Richard Nixon.
I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent.
Does any president have as complex and tangled a legacy as President Nixon? For years, Nixon struggled to maintain a foothold in politics, even throwing in the towel altogether after losing the 1960 presidential election and 1962 California gubernatorial election. When he finally ascended to the presidency in 1969, the 37th Commander-in-Chief made a number of significant accomplishments. These included pulling American soldiers out of the Vietnam War, establishing diplomatic relations with China, and enacting several progressive environmental policies.
I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
And enacting several progressive environmental policies. Nixon's popularity and string of achievements came to a screeching halt once his involvement with the now infamous Watergate scandal was exposed. When it was proven that Nixon had conspired to illegally surveil his political opponents, he became the only president to resign from his post.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. Number 1, Donald Trump.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame.
Whether you love him or hate him, it's inarguable that President Trump is a politician unlike any other. How do we even begin to list the ways that the 45th and 47th president is controversial? Well, let's list some of his firsts. Trump is the only president in history to have served without previous military or government experience, and also the only president to have been impeached twice.
You're declaring open war on American democracy. You are the ones interfering in America's elections. You are the ones subverting America's democracy. We did nothing wrong, nothing whatsoever. This was just an excuse.
Trump's actions in office have garnered significant widespread controversy, like his 2017 travel ban that targeted Muslim countries and his unprecedented 2025 efforts to deport literally millions of undocumented immigrants. We could go on, but it's worth noting that his May 2024 conviction for falsifying business records makes him the only president to face such a criminal charge.
I'm totally innocent. I did nothing wrong. They talk about business records, and the business records were extremely accurately counted. I had nothing to do with them. That was done by an accountant or a bookkeeper who I think gave very credible testimony and was corroborated by everybody that was asked.
Which president's actions shocked you the most? Are there any we missed? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. Did you enjoy this video? Check out these other clips from WatchMojo. And be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.